Welcome to another session of Business Startup Training. Today we'll be looking at recession or depression. What's the meaning? This is presented by Accounting Lecture. Like, share, subscribe. Let's first of all look at an acronym. PRDE. P is prosperity, R is recession, D is for depression, and E is for improvement. In the quadrants here, we see P. P is where we have prosperity or growth. R is where we have recession. And you see it's in a recession quadrant, so there's a downward trajectory. D is depression, also in a downward trajectory. And E is improvement. And that cycle continues over several periods. So in the 1800s, steam engine and cotton were the main drivers of economic growth. In the 1850s, rail and steel was the main drivers. Electronic engineering and chemistry in the 1900s. In the 1950s, we have petrochemical and automobiles were driving the boom at that time. Technology and innovation and information technology rather in the 1900s. So that's what's driving our economy. And I would say in 2020 all the way up to now, I think social media is driving economic growth at this point. So by the end of the session, we'll have a better understanding of recession and depression and the meaning for businesses. So our objectives, what are objectives? The first one is, what's a recession? What's a depression? How does a recession or a depression affect businesses? How can we learn from history? And then we will conclude. Now let's first of all look at what is a recession. A recession is a period of temporary economic decline during which trade and industry activity are reduced, generally identified by a fall in GDP in two successive quarters. Quarters here we would consider to be 3 months. So January, February, March is a quarter, April, May, June is another quarter. So for 2 consecutive quarters, a fall in GDP results in a recession. Now what's a depression? In terms of economics, a depression is a sustained and long-term downturn in economic activity in one or more of the economies. It is more severe economic downturn than a recession, which is a slowing down in economic activity over the course of the normal business cycle. So a prolonged recession is a depression. So a recession normally is 2 quarters. So anything over 2 quarters of negative growth will be a depression. Now let's have a look at the concept of quarters. Here, in terms of a normal economy, we see January, February, March, the economic growth is 1%. April, May, June, the economic growth is 2%. July, August, September, 2%. October, November, December, 3%. So overall, the economy grew an average 2% over the year. So that's the growth in the GDP when the economy is in normal growth flight, when there's an upward trajectory. Here we have another picture that looks at the contrary. So January, February, March, we have a growth of 3%, but April, May, June, there's a negative growth of 1%. July, August, September, negative growth of 2%. October, November, December, we have negative of 3%. So overall, the economy contracted by negative 0.75. So that's the opposite to what has happened. So when the economy contracts, so overall we have a negative situation at the end of 4 quarters, it is resulting in a recession or a depression. And because in this instance we have 3 quarters, quarters 1, quarters 2, 3, and 4, we can say that this is a depression. 2 and 3 as a recession, with 4 added, that's a depression. So let's have a look at a graph. Now here we can see on this graph that every 10 years there is a depression. Now let's actually look at it a little bit more in detail. So we can see a recession was recorded in the 1960s, One was recorded in the 1970s, one in 1975, one in 1980, one in 1983, one in 1980, one in 1993, one in 2004, and one in 2008. And we can see the red line. It's actually trying to predict what the economic situation is going to look like. But in 2020, we're heading into a recession, which we also could almost assume to be also a depression. But let's look at this a little bit more in detail. If we observe the data, we can see here that every 10 years there seems to be a significant financial shock. So we can also forecast that in 2030 we will have another recession or depression. And in 2040 we can also have another one. So we can actually plan for them, because this is how the economy actually grows. It has a growth, then it has a bust, or a downward trajectory, and then it recovers and it grows again. That's how it is, like a wave. Now let's have a look at this graph, because this graph looks at the Great Depression. Now here we can see that the Great Depression started in 1929. It then was pronounced in 1930. Then it continued in 1931, 1932. But in 1933, we can see that there's an upward trajectory. So it's now moving from, it's no longer declining, it's actually moving upward. 1934, upward. But it actually recovered to pre-recessionary level or depression in 1936. Again, in 1937, it again peaked, and then it fell again in 1938, and then has recovered subsequent. So this can gives us an idea. So we see again that things to notice. It started in 1929. That's when the drop began. It ended in 1933, so it lasted about 3 years. Again, we can see return to growth was in 1936, so it took several years. So basically that's about 7 years to recover to the level it was. Now the recovery period may take long. The decline in the economy may be shorter, but it doesn't necessarily mean, even though you might have economic growth in years to come, it doesn't mean that you have recovered to the level you were before. So it took 7 years to get to the level that the economy was before, but it took 3 years to actually have the bottoming out of the recessionary curve. And then we had a second one, a slight one in 1938, and that's main things to observe. How does a recession or depression affect business? Now, in terms of a recession, demand falls for non-essential goods. So there's a fall in, luxury goods, etc. It's going to fall. High levels of unemployment tends to take place. Businesses will close in large scale, so a lot of businesses will go. Economic output will fall. Inflation in some instances, and also we may have high inflation. Some may have low inflation, but also we could also have high inflation. And we also have the credit availability will fall, which means that the bank is going to be scrutinizing even in more detail those who are intending to borrow. And so because not everybody will qualify, that is going to cause the black market to thrive, because other lenders who will take the risk of lending to people in this time will capitalize on the fact that credit is a little bit under greater scrutiny, because employment or unemployment is going to be high. What can we learn from history? Here, a recession tends to last for 3 years. In worst cases, it could also last up to 7 years. We can also observe that every 10 years there seems to be a recession or depression. We can also observe that the business cycle holds true, and the economy has a wave, so it goes up and down, up and down. So it's an economic wave. Recession creates opportunity for businesses. So those businesses that can innovate are the ones who will survive when a recession or depression sets in. The Great Recession in the 1930s followed by a huge birth rate. Now in 2020, a lot of people are staying home. We may have a situation where we have a huge birth rate subsequent to the return to work. This is yet to be seen, but if the world is staying home, the birth rate is going to be high. So next year, between December and January or February of next year, we will see the results of this, but we may have a high birth rate. Now, what can we conclude? What's a recession? We said a recession is a decline in economic output or GDP for 2 consecutive quarters. A depression is a decline in GDP for more than 2 consecutive quarters. So 3, 4, 5, etc. is a depression. How does a recession or depression affect businesses? We know that there will be a fall in demand for non-essential goods. There will also be a scrutiny on credit. There will also be a situation where there will be high unemployment. So there will be challenging times in a recession. What can we learn from history? We can learn that in the 1930s, the recession lasted from 1929 to 1933. So it can last up to 3 years. And the full recovery actually took 7 years to pre-growth level. So these are some of the things that we can learn. Like, share, subscribe. Thank you.